In 2019, the world celebrated what was supposed to be a miracle, a biotech breakthrough that promised to cure diseases, extend human life, and redefine medicine forever. But behind the glossy press releases and spotless white labs, something sinister was happening in the shadows. This is the dark truth behind Project Umbra. A secret experiment that used people no one would miss. A cure that came with a price no one was meant to discover. And a whistleblower who risked everything to expose it. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in the heart of Boston's tech corridor. Project Umbra was the kind of biotech startup that made headlines before it even existed: clean white labs, a board of young, ambitious scientists, and promises that seemed almost too good to be true. They called it a cure, a breakthrough in regenerative medicine, something that could literally extend human life and erase certain diseases entirely. Investors flocked. Media outlets fawned. But behind the glossy press releases, something darker was stirring. People remember the initial excitement. The company was small, operating out of a converted warehouse that smelled faintly of antiseptic and plastic. The founders, 3 of them, were celebrated in local business journals as geniuses, visionaries pushing the boundaries of science. They had charm, credentials, and a very particular kind of charisma that made you feel like you were witnessing the dawn of a new era. They spoke about curing genetic disorders, repairing damaged organs, even reversing certain degenerative conditions. To the public, it sounded like science fiction coming to life. But science fiction has a habit of masking truth. Behind closed doors, Project Umbra's work was not just cutting edge, it was secretive. And in those shadows, the company was running trials that no ethics committee would ever approve. Patients weren't volunteering, and they weren't even fully aware of what was happening to them. Some were transient populations, people no one would notice if they disappeared for weeks. Others were quietly coerced, given promises of treatment or money in exchange for participation, with contracts no one really read. In the lab, these human subjects weren't patients, they were experiments. It started with whispers among the staff. A junior researcher named Emily Sanders was the first to raise concerns internally. She'd been thrilled to work at Project Umbra, she believed in the mission, in the possibility of healing lives. But over time, she noticed anomalies. Vials were labeled inconsistently, paperwork didn't match procedures, and some patients' consent forms were either incomplete or outright falsified. When she raised questions, the management dismissed her. They told her she didn't understand the bigger picture. They reminded her that breakthroughs require sacrifice, and in science, progress is messy. Emily's unease grew when she discovered that the cure, the one everyone was so eager to celebrate, wasn't fully tested. The treatment involved a combination of gene therapy and nanotechnology, designed to trigger regenerative processes in the body. Early results were promising. Some patients recovered from injuries that should have left them permanently disabled. Others displayed improvements in chronic conditions. On paper, it was a miracle. But the anomalies weren't being reported. Side effects were being minimized. People were having neurological symptoms, mood swings, memory lapses, episodes of aggression, but these were filed as temporary and expected rather than flagged for further investigation. By late 2019, rumors of unethical testing began leaking outside the company. A few investigative journalists noticed discrepancies between the public success stories and patient accounts on social media. One anonymous post described an unmarked van picking up patients from a homeless shelter. Another talked about late-night visits to the lab, where volunteers would emerge days later confused, disoriented, or injured. Authorities initially dismissed these stories as exaggeration, but the threads were there, faint but persistent. Emily, now terrified for her own safety, began documenting everything. She copied emails, screenshots of lab schedules, and reports of adverse effects. She reached out to regulators, hoping someone would intervene before anyone else got hurt. But regulators were slow. Project Umbra had been careful, there was always plausible deniability. Contracts had tiny clauses, consent forms were worded in legalese, and patients often didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to. By the time anyone noticed, it was almost impossible to track the extent of the experiments. One of the early victims was a man named Thomas Keller. Thomas was a former construction worker, living paycheck to paycheck. He was offered free treatment for a chronic back injury that left him unable to work. He signed the consent forms, though he admitted later he didn't understand much of the jargon. The treatment seemed benign at first: regular blood tests, therapy sessions, and injections. But after 2 weeks, things changed. He started hallucinating, seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing whispers at night. He couldn't sleep. When he returned to the lab to report these symptoms, he was reassured that it was part of the body adjusting, and was given a sedative. After another week, he vanished. His family reported him missing, but without evidence tying the lab to his disappearance, authorities had no leads. Stories like Thomas's were not isolated. Emily's documents revealed a pattern: people showing up, being administered the treatment, and then disappearing or suffering severe, unexplained neurological decline. In some cases, the company quietly paid settlements to families who asked questions, framing it as rare complications. In others, people simply vanished. Emily realized that the company wasn't just cutting corners, they were systematically using vulnerable populations as test subjects, exploiting legal gray areas and human empathy. Internally, the atmosphere at Project Umbra became tense. The founders, once genial and inspirational, grew secretive and controlling. Meetings were held behind closed doors, with new security protocols and restricted access to the labs. Employees who questioned decisions were subtly pressured to leave. Whistleblowers were threatened, and some even received mysterious messages implying their careers, and personal safety, could be at risk if they spoke out. Emily, terrified but determined, started reaching out to journalists. She found a reporter named Marcus Reed, known for his investigative work into corporate malfeasance. Marcus agreed to meet, and over the next several months, they pieced together the company's activities. They tracked patients, cross-referenced lab schedules, and interviewed former employees who were too scared to go on record but shared details off the record. They learned that Project Umbra had developed a secondary version of the treatment, introduced quietly after initial tests, a more aggressive protocol aimed at faster results. But it had an extraordinarily high risk of neurological damage and was being administered selectively, sometimes to people incapable of refusing. By mid-2020, Marcus had enough material for a story, but publishing was risky. Project Umbra had lawyers, investors, and even local government connections that could make a lawsuit devastating. Emily warned that going public could put her in danger. She had already been followed home twice and noticed unmarked cars outside her apartment. But the evidence couldn't be ignored. The story needed to be told. Their investigation culminated in a series of articles exposing the company's practices. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Investors pulled funding. Regulators opened investigations. The FBI began monitoring the lab for possible violations of human experimentation laws. Project Umbra's founders publicly denied wrongdoing, framing the reports as misinterpretation and overblown fears, but the damage was done. Despite the exposure, some of the darkest truths never came fully to light. Patients who had vanished were never found. Some survivors reported lingering side effects, neurological, psychological, and physical, that were never fully treated. Others were quietly relocated or had their records sealed in settlements. It became clear that while the company was dismantled, the human cost remained largely invisible to the outside world. The psychological toll on the whistleblowers was significant. Emily, despite her bravery, struggled with nightmares and paranoia. She constantly wondered who she could trust and whether those responsible for the experiments were still at large. Marcus, too, faced threats and legal intimidation for his reporting, though he refused to back down. Their work exposed the truth, but it also revealed how fragile accountability can be when profit and ambition outweigh ethics. Project Umbra became a case study in what happens when scientific ambition goes unchecked. It wasn't just a story about unethical experiments, it was a story about human nature, greed, and the blurry line between innovation and exploitation. It raised questions about oversight, about the vulnerabilities in our legal and medical systems, and about how easily trust can be manipulated. Years later, the facility that housed Project Umbra was abandoned, the windows boarded, the labs emptied, yet locals still spoke of strange occurrences, lights flickering in the night, unmarked vans, rumors of people seen entering but never leaving. The building became a symbol of unanswered questions, a silent reminder that some experiments leave a footprint that cannot easily be erased. And yet, for all the reporting, investigations, and media coverage, the full truth of what happened inside Project Umbra may never be known. Some documents were destroyed, some witnesses silenced, and some victims permanently lost to the system. The cure that promised life, longevity, and healing had a hidden cost, one paid in fear, pain, and lives taken without consent. In the end, Project Umbra was more than a failed startup or a corporate scandal. It was a cautionary tale of human ambition unchecked by conscience, and of the darkness that can linger when those in power decide that some lives are expendable. The names of the victims, the faces of the survivors, and the echoes of the experiments themselves remain hidden in plain sight, a lingering reminder that not every breakthrough is benevolent, and not every cure comes without a price. And sometimes, when you think about it, the scariest part isn't that they experimented on unwilling subjects, it's that they succeeded far enough to make the world believe it was a miracle.